You ever hear someone tell a story that makes you shiver no matter how warm it is outside? Well, that's what I've got for you. It happened one winter when I agreed, against my better judgment, to join my buddy Jack at his uncle's cabin in the woods. "It'll be fun," Jack had said. "We'll unplug, have a few beers, and enjoy the snow. You need it, man." And yeah, maybe I did need it. Life had been kicking my ass lately. Work was stressful. My girlfriend dumped me, and I'd been feeling like a total loser. Jack knew I needed a break, so I caved. We set off late one afternoon. It was already freezing, and snow started falling hard about an hour into the drive. Jack's Jeep wasn't exactly equipped for mountain roads, and let me tell you, sliding around on ice isn't my idea of fun. "Relax, man," Jack kept saying as we wound through the forest. "I've done this drive 1,000,000 times." But I wasn't relaxed. The headlights barely cut through the swirling snow, and the forest, something about it felt off. The trees were tall and black, their bare branches reaching like claws. The further we went, the more uneasy I felt. At one point, I thought I saw something, a shadow darting between the trees. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. "See what?" Jack glanced at me, then back at the road. "I don't know. Someone? It moved." Jack laughed. "You're already freaking yourself out, and we're not even there yet." But I wasn't freaking out. I knew what I saw. It was tall, too tall to be human, and the way it moved, it wasn't right. Jack turned up the music, probably to drown out my paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest felt alive in the worst way, like it was watching us, waiting for something. By the time we got to the cabin, it was pitch black, and the temperature had dropped so low that the air burned when you breathed it in. The place looked exactly how I imagined it, small, old, and half buried in snow. A single porch light flickered above the door, casting long shadows across the clearing. "Home sweet home," Jack said, hopping out of the Jeep. I stayed inside for a moment longer, staring at the tree line. The wind whistled through the branches, and for a second I thought I saw movement again. But when I blinked, it was gone. "Hey, you coming or what?" Jack called. Yeah. I grabbed my bag and followed him up the rickety steps. The door creaked like it hadn't been opened in years, and the inside smelled like dust and wood smoke. The cabin was cozy, I guess, if you like that kind of thing. There was a small living room with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and a couple of bedrooms in the back. It felt like stepping into a time capsule. No TV, no Wi-Fi, and no central heating. Just an old wood stove and a stack of logs in the corner. Jack dropped his bag onto the couch and clapped his hands together like this was some great adventure. "See? Perfect," he said, grinning like an idiot. I wasn't convinced. The place gave me the creeps, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Maybe it was the silence, broken only by the occasional groan of the wind outside, or maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, pooling in the corners of the room. Jack was already poking around, opening cabinets and rattling things in the kitchen. "There's even beer!" he shouted, holding up a dusty six-pack like it was gold. "Great," I muttered, setting my stuff down. The first night passed uneventfully, at least at first. We sat by the fire, drank a couple of beers, and talked about stupid stuff like old times. Jack was his usual carefree self, completely unfazed by the storm howling outside. Me? I couldn't stop glancing at the windows. It wasn't until we turned in for the night that things got weird. I was lying in bed, fully clothed because it was freezing, even with 2 blankets, when I heard it, the faintest tap, tap, tap on the window. At first I thought it was the wind, maybe a branch brushing against the glass. But then it came again, steady and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up, my breath fogging in the icy air. The window was across the room, and I couldn't see much from where I was. but I swear I could feel something out there, something watching me. Jack, I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. Jack, I said again, louder this time. What? He groaned from the next room. Do you hear that? Hear what? The tapping on the window. There was a pause, then the sound of his heavy footsteps as he came down the hall. He opened my door, looking half asleep. You're seriously freaking out over some wind? He said, rubbing his eyes. It's not the wind, I insisted. Jack rolled his eyes and walked over to the window. He yanked the curtain aside and peered out into the night. See? Nothing, just snow and trees. He let the curtain drop and turned back to me. Relax, man. You are letting this place get to you. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that didn't want to be seen. The next day, the storm hadn't let up. If anything, it was worse. The snow was piled high against the windows, and the Jeep was buried up to its tires. Looks like we're stuck here for a while, Jack said, shoveling a spoonful of cereal into his mouth. He didn't seem the least bit concerned, but I couldn't say the same for myself. As the day dragged on, the uneasy feeling in my chest only grew. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see... Well, I didn't know what I expected to see, but whatever it was, I hoped it stayed far away. Then I found the journal. It was tucked away in a drawer in the living room, hidden beneath a stack of yellowed newspapers. The leather cover was cracked and worn, and the pages inside were filled with scrawled handwriting. "What's that?" Jack asked, looking up from his phone. "Not sure," I said, flipping through the pages. "Looks like someone's diary or something." The entries were dated decades ago, written by Jack's uncle, the one who'd owned the cabin. Most of it was mundane stuff about hunting and fixing up the place, but then I came across a passage that made my blood run cold. The storm hasn't let up in days. The woods feel different, darker somehow. Last night, I heard something outside, footsteps, slow and heavy. I didn't dare look out the window, but I could feel it watching me. I don't think I'm alone out here. Jack, did your uncle ever say anything weird about this place? I asked, holding up the journal. Jack shrugged. Not really. He wasn't exactly the talkative type. I read the passage out loud, and Jack just laughed. Come on, man. He was probably just losing his mind out here. Too much isolation will do that to you. But I wasn't so sure. Something about those words felt too real, too close to what I was feeling. That night, the tapping started again. Tap, tap, tap. Only this time, it wasn't at my window. It was at the front door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Jack was snoring on the couch, oblivious. Jack, I hissed, shaking his shoulder. Wake up. Huh? What is it? He mumbled, blinking groggily. Listen. The tapping came again, louder this time. Probably just a branch, Jack said, rubbing his eyes. It's not a branch, I said through gritted teeth. Branches don't knock. Jack groaned and got up, stumbling toward the door. All right, let's settle this. Don't open it, I whispered harshly, but he ignored me. He flicked on the porch light and peered through the peephole. There's nothing there, he said, turning back to me. Are you sure? Positive. Look for yourself. I hesitated, then stepped up to the door. I pressed my eye to the peephole and scanned the porch, just snow and darkness. But as I turned away, I saw it. A flash of movement at the edge of the clearing. Something tall. Something wrong. I backed away from the door, my mouth dry. Jack, I said, barely able to get the words out. There's something out there. Jesus, again with this? He groaned, slumping back onto the couch. You're freaking yourself out over nothing. No, I'm serious. I saw something. It was out there, just past the tree line. Jack didn't even bother looking up from his phone this time. Look, man, if there's some big scary monster in the woods, why hasn't it knocked the door down and eaten us already? Huh? Relax. I wanted to punch him. How could he not feel it? that creeping sense of wrongness, the weight of something watching us. But there was no use arguing. He wasn't going to listen. I spent the rest of the evening sitting by the fire, staring into the flames and trying to convince myself I hadn't seen what I knew I had. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe I was overtired. Maybe... Tap. My stomach dropped. Tap. Tap. I whipped my head toward the sound. It wasn't the front door this time. It was coming from the side of the cabin. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Jack sighed loudly. "I'm not getting up again. You want to go check? Be my guest." For a moment, I thought about staying put, ignoring it, and pretending everything was fine. But the tapping was so deliberate, so measured, that it felt impossible to ignore. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the side window. My hands were shaking so badly that the beam of light danced wildly across the walls. When I got to the window, I stopped, my breath fogging up the glass. The tapping had stopped. I stood there for a few seconds, heart pounding in my ears, trying to work up the nerve to pull the curtain aside. Finally, I did. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but snow and trees. I let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through me. Maybe it really was just the wind. Maybe something moved. It was so quick I almost missed it. A blur of motion just outside the beam of light. I swung the flashlight toward it, my pulse hammering. Nothing. I stood there for what felt like forever, my eyes darting between the trees, searching for any sign of movement. The only sound was the wind howling through the forest, and then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was pale, almost gray, and stretched tight over its frame, like it didn't belong. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring at the cabin, at me. I stumbled back from the window, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. "What's wrong now?" Jack said from the couch, his voice thick with irritation. There's something out there," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. Jack groaned and got up, dragging himself to the window. He peered out, squinting into the darkness. "There's nothing there," he said after a moment, shaking his head. "You're losing it, man." "No," I said, my voice rising. "I saw it. It was right there." Jack rolled his eyes. "Look, you need to chill. You're just spooking yourself." But I knew what I'd seen, and no amount of Jack's dismissive attitude could convince me otherwise. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire with a poker in my hand, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin. Every time the wind picked up, I braced myself for the tapping to start again. But it didn't. Not that night. The next day, the storm had settled into a quiet, suffocating blanket of gray. The snow outside was piled so high against the cabin that opening the front door was nearly impossible. Jack, as usual, didn't seem bothered. "Guess we're snowed in for a bit," he said, crunching down on some stale granola. "Better get comfortable." I wasn't comfortable. Not even close. I'd spent the entire night listening for sounds I didn't want to hear, jumping at every creak of the old wooden walls. And even though nothing had happened after the tapping stopped, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, was still out there, watching, waiting. While Jack sprawled out on the couch, scrolling through his phone in a futile search for a signal, I decided to poke around the cabin. I told myself it was just to kill time, but the truth was I was looking for answers, something, anything, that might explain what was going on. That's when I found the trap door. It was in the small hallway between the kitchen and the bedrooms, a square of wood set flush into the floor with a rusty metal ring for a handle. I'd walked over it a dozen times without noticing, but now it felt like it was screaming at me. "Hey, Jack," I called out, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. "Yeah? Did you know there's a basement?" Jack sat up and frowned. "A basement? No way." "Come look." He joined me in the hallway, and we both stared down at the trap door. "Well, that's creepy as hell," Jack said, laughing nervously. "Think we should open it?" Jack hesitated, then shrugged. "Why not? Probably just a root cellar or something." He grabbed the ring and gave it a tug. The trap door groaned as it opened, revealing a narrow set of wooden stairs descending into darkness. A damp, musty smell wafted up, and I had to fight the urge to gag. "After you," Jack said, smirking. "Yeah, right," I muttered. We ended up going down together, Jack leading the way with his phone's flashlight. The stairs creaked under our weight, and the air grew colder with each step. At the bottom, the space opened up into a small, low-ceilinged room lined with shelves. Most of them were empty, but a few held jars of what looked like pickled vegetables, though they were so old and cloudy it was hard to tell for sure. But it wasn't the jars that caught my attention. It was the markings on the walls. Symbols, carved deep into the wood, looping and intersecting in ways that hurt to look at. They covered every inch of the walls, ceiling, and floor, as if whoever had put them there was desperate to keep something in or out. "What the hell is this?" Jack whispered, running his fingers over one of the carvings. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely audible, "but I don't think it's good." Jack laughed nervously. "It's probably just some weird art project or something. You know how people are?" "Yeah, sure." But even as I said it, I knew he was wrong. The symbols felt wrong, like they were alive somehow, pulsing faintly under the beam of Jack's flashlight. "All right, this is officially too creepy," Jack said, heading back up the stairs. "Let's get out of here." I didn't argue. That night, I was convinced I wouldn't sleep again, but exhaustion finally got the better of me, and I drifted off sometime after midnight. I woke up to the sound of Jack screaming. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. The scream was coming from the living room. "Jack!" I shouted, throwing off the blankets and stumbling toward the sound. When I got there, I found him standing by the window, pale as a ghost and shaking like a leaf. "What happened?" I demanded. I saw it," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Saw what?" "The thing you were talking about. It was out there, staring at me." I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. "What did it look like?" Jack swallowed hard. "Tall, pale. Its arms were wrong. Too long. It was just standing there looking at me." I didn't say, "I told you so," though I wanted to. Instead, I grabbed the poker from the fireplace and stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. "Is it still there?" I asked. Jack shook his head. It walked away when I turned on the light. For the first time, Jack looked as scared as I felt. "We need to leave," I said. "How?" "The Jeep's buried and the storm's not letting up any time soon." I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing for sure. We couldn't stay here. The next few hours were the longest of my life. Jack and I sat in the living room, weapons in hand, a poker for me, a kitchen knife for him, jumping at every little noise. Around 3 a.m., the tapping started again, but this time it wasn't at the door. It was on the roof. Tap, tap, tap. We both froze, staring at the ceiling. The sound was slow, deliberate, and unmistakably footsteps. "Is it on the roof?" Jack whispered, his voice trembling. I nodded, gripping the poker so tight my knuckles ached. The footsteps moved, circling above us, the wood creaking under its weight. And then, without warning, they stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. "What's it doing?" Jack whispered. "I don't know," I said, barely able to get the words out. And then the power went out. We barricaded ourselves in one of the bedrooms, dragging the bed frame against the door and piling anything we could find on top of it. I shoved the dresser against the window for good measure, though I wasn't sure it would make a difference. Jack was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands, muttering to himself. I couldn't tell if he was praying or losing it, or maybe both. "What the hell is this thing?" he whispered. "I don't know," I said, gripping the fireplace poker like it was the only thing keeping me alive. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind howling like a living thing. Every so often, we'd hear faint tapping or scratching at the walls, but it never tried to break in. It didn't need to. It was wearing us down piece by piece. Sometime before dawn, the noises stopped. The wind died down, and for the first time in hours, the world outside seemed quiet. "Do you think it's gone?" Jack asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I said honestly. We sat there for what felt like forever, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The storm had passed, and the world outside was eerily still. Finally, Jack stood up. "I'm going to check," he said. "Are you insane?" I hissed. "We can't stay in here forever," he said, grabbing the kitchen knife from the floor. "If it's gone, we need to dig out the Jeep and get the hell out of here." I wanted to argue, but deep down, I knew he was right. Reluctantly, I followed him to the door. He held up a hand to stop me, then cracked it open just enough to peek outside. The clearing was empty. "No sign of it," he whispered, stepping out onto the porch. The snow was deep, but the sky was clear now, the first pale hints of dawn breaking over the horizon. I joined him, my breath freezing in the air. The woods were still, the snow undisturbed except for a set of footprints leading away from the cabin. But as I looked closer, I realized something was wrong. The footprints weren't human. They were too large, with long, spindly impressions where claws should have been. Jack followed my gaze, his face draining of color. Those aren't ours," he whispered. "No," I said, my voice barely audible. "They're not." And then, from somewhere deep in the woods, we heard it. The laugh, low, guttural, and impossibly close. It wasn't gone. It was waiting. Jack and I locked eyes, frozen in the icy grip of fear. The laugh, the same unnatural, guttural laugh, echoed again, bouncing between the trees. It felt too close, yet too far, as if the forest itself was throwing the sound around just to torment us. "We need to move," I whispered, gripping the poker so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Now!" Jack nodded, but his legs weren't cooperating. He just stood there, staring at the tree line, his breath puffing out in uneven clouds. The laugh came again, louder this time, and it broke whatever trance he was in. "Jeep," he said, his voice trembling. "We dig it out, we leave, no stopping." We stumbled off the porch and into the snow. It was deeper than I'd realized, nearly up to my knees, and every step was a struggle. The Jeep was half buried in a mound of snow, its dark shape barely visible against the pale landscape. "Dig," Jack said, his voice sharper now, more desperate. He grabbed a rusted snow shovel leaning against the cabin and tossed me a second one. I didn't even remember seeing them before, but I didn't care. We had to hurry. The shovels clanged and scraped against the ice-crusted snow as we worked frantically, every movement driven by raw panic. The air was so cold it burned my lungs, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Jack was muttering under his breath, a constant stream of curses and prayers that I pretended not to hear. Then the sound came again. Not the laugh this time. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from the woods. "Jack!" I hissed, stopping mid-swing. He froze, his shovel clattering to the ground. "It's coming," he whispered, his face pale. "It's coming!" The footsteps grew louder, crunching through the snow with a deliberate slowness that made my skin crawl. I turned toward the woods, my heart hammering in my chest. At first I didn't see anything, just trees and shadows and the faint glow of dawn on the horizon. Then it stepped out of the tree line. It was worse than I remembered. Taller, thinner, its limbs impossibly long and twisted. Its skin was pale and stretched so tightly over its frame that I could see the outlines of its bones. And its face, God, its face, was blank. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, featureless flesh. It stood there, motionless, watching us with a presence so oppressive it felt like the air itself was pressing down on me. "Run!" I whispered. My voice barely carried over the distance between us, but Jack heard me. We abandoned the jeep and bolted back toward the cabin, our feet slipping and sliding in the snow. The thing didn't move. Not at first. It just stood there, tilting its head slightly as if it was curious. Then it began to walk. Its strides were slow but impossibly long, covering more ground than seemed natural. It didn't run. It didn't need to. It knew we had nowhere to go. We made it to the cabin, slamming the door behind us and throwing the lock. Jack dragged the couch in front of it, while I grabbed the poker again, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. "What do we do?" Jack panted, his back against the wall. "What the hell do we do?" I didn't have an answer. My mind was spinning, every instinct screaming at me to do something, anything, but I couldn't think. All I could do was listen to the sound of its footsteps circling the cabin. Tap, tap, tap. The sound stopped suddenly, replaced by a long scraping noise. I turned toward the front window just in time to see it press a hand, if you could call it that, against the glass. The fingers were long and thin, ending in sharp claw-like tips. It tilted its head again as if it were studying us. "Why isn't it breaking in?" Jack whispered. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely audible. Maybe it doesn't need to." Jack looked at me, his eyes wide with terror. "What does that mean?" Before I could answer, the lights flickered back on, casting the room in harsh, artificial light. For a moment, I thought it might scare the thing away, but it didn't move. It just stood there, its featureless face pressed against the glass, as if it were staring directly at us. Then it raised one long clawed finger and tapped on the window. "Tap, tap, tap," Jack screamed. I didn't blame him. The sound was deliberate, mocking, like it was toying with us. I turned back to the fire, grabbing a bottle of lighter fluid from the hearth. "We're not going to wait for it to decide what it wants," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "If it gets in, we burn it. The whole place, if we have to." Jack nodded, though he looked like he was on the verge of a breakdown. "Do you think fire will work?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but I'm not sitting here and doing nothing." The thing outside stopped tapping. Slowly, it straightened up and stepped back from the window. For a moment, it just stood there, its head tilted as if it were listening to something we couldn't hear. Then it smiled. It didn't have a mouth, but it smiled. The skin where its mouth should have been stretched and split, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The sight was so wrong, so unnatural, that I staggered back, bile rising in my throat, and then it was gone. 1 second it was there, and the next it had vanished into the snow. For a moment we just stood there staring at the empty window. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us dared to move. "Is it gone?" Jack whispered finally. "I don't know," I said. But deep down I didn't believe it was. And I was right. The next sound we heard wasn't the tapping. It was the trap door from the basement. The trap door creaked open, and a chill swept through the cabin, colder than anything the storm outside had produced. My breath hitched, and for a moment I couldn't move. I didn't want to move. I just stood there, the poker gripped tightly in my hand, staring at the dark outline of the basement door. Jack was the first to speak. His voice was low, almost strangled. "It's down there. I think it's down there." I nodded. I couldn't say anything. It was all starting to make sense now. The symbols, the silence, the mimicking of our voices. That thing hadn't just been waiting outside. It had been here the whole time, watching us, waiting for us to be desperate enough to make a mistake. The scraping sound came again, louder this time, as if something was dragging itself across the floor beneath us. "Get away from the door," I said, barely managing to push the words out. "Get away, now!" Jack didn't hesitate. He moved away from the basement entrance, stumbling toward the far wall, his eyes wide with panic. I backed away too, keeping the poker out in front of me, my hands trembling. The air felt thick with something suffocating, heavy, Alive. The trapdoor groaned again, and this time the scraping wasn't just a noise, it was a presence, a slow, deliberate shift of something large and unnatural crawling its way toward us from below. The door creaked open wider. I don't know what I expected to see. Maybe nothing at all. Maybe the cabin would just remain silent, and we'd wake up from this nightmare, but that's not what happened. From the darkness below, a pale hand emerged, fingers too long, twisted and clawed, dripping with some dark, sticky substance. The nails were sharp, like the tips of broken glass, gleaming in the faint light. It pulled itself up, inch by inch, and then I saw its face again, the same smooth, featureless skin stretched across its skull, its long limbs unfolding one at a time, like a broken puppet. Jack screamed again. This time I couldn't help him. I was paralyzed, frozen in place as the thing slowly rose from the basement, its body impossibly long, like it had been stretched out beyond human proportions. It wasn't just outside. It wasn't just in the woods. It was in the house with us now, and it was hungry. The thing's head turned toward us, and even though it didn't have eyes, I felt it looking at us. I felt it seeing us, measuring us, waiting. Then it made a sound, a noise so alien, so guttural, that it took me a moment to realize it was laughing, not a laugh of joy. This was a laugh of pure malice, something that knew we couldn't escape. It knew we were trapped. Jack stumbled backward, his breath ragged. What the hell is it? What does it want? I shook my head, unable to speak. I was frozen, my body refusing to obey the command to run, to fight, to do anything. The thing crept forward, its limbs contorting in ways they shouldn't have been able to. It didn't move like an animal. It moved like a shadow. No, not even a shadow. A presence that was there and not there at the same time. Its head tilted again, and the smile, a rictus grin of sharp, jagged teeth, appeared, splitting its face open wide. It raised a hand, and for a split second, I thought it was going to reach for us. But instead, it pointed toward the window. And then it spoke. Its voice wasn't mine anymore. It wasn't Jack's either. It wasn't anything human. "You're not alone!" it rasped, its voice like nails scraping across glass, a sound that tasted like decay. "The forest is watching!" I didn't even have the strength to scream. I was too terrified to do anything except stare at it, paralyzed by the awful realization that this wasn't a creature anymore. It was a force, a presence that stretched beyond the confines of the cabin, beyond the woods. Something ancient, something that had been waiting for us. The air in the cabin grew thick, oppressive. I couldn't breathe properly, my chest tightening with each passing second. I could feel its presence moving closer, getting into my skin, my head, my heart. The walls began to groan as if they too were being crushed under its weight. Jack was moving now, slowly, stumbling toward the door. "We need to leave. We need to get out," he cried, but there was nothing in his voice except desperation. The thing didn't react. It just stood there, waiting. But as Jack reached the door, something strange happened. The air turned colder, and the room seemed to shift. The walls bent and warped, distorting the space. The ground beneath us trembled, a low hum vibrating through the floor, and then, from somewhere far off in the woods, came the sound of more footsteps, dozens of them. I turned toward the window, and in the light of the rising dawn, I saw them. Figures, tall, thin, and featureless. They moved in a slow, deliberate procession, emerging from the trees like phantoms. They were everywhere, dozens, maybe more, each one like the thing in the basement, its pale, twisted limbs bending and folding in ways they shouldn't. I realized in that moment that we hadn't been trapped by one. We had been trapped by them. "They're coming," I whispered, my voice cracking. "We're not getting out of here." The thing in the basement began to move toward us again, its footsteps slow but inexorable, its twisted limbs reaching, pulling itself up the stairs. I felt a surge of panic, my limbs shaking with the overwhelming urge to run, to get away, anywhere, but I knew it was too late. The doors were locked, the windows sealed, and now the creatures were outside and inside. The hum in the air grew louder, reverberating in my skull, a constant vibrating pressure. The thing's clawed fingers scraped against the floorboards, drawing closer, and then it was standing right in front of me, towering above me. Its smile grew wider, and then it spoke again. This time, its voice echoed inside my head, cold and final. "You belong to us now." The creature's smile widened, its jagged teeth gleaming like broken glass in the dim light. I could feel my pulse hammering in my throat, my limbs aching with terror. This wasn't just some monster anymore. This was it, the thing that had been hunting us since we stepped into this God-forsaken cabin. "We belong to them now," it said again, its voice slithering into my mind like ice water, freezing my very thoughts. It lunged. I barely had time to react, but the poker in my hand became my lifeline. I swung it wildly, hoping to make contact, to stop it from reaching us. The thing twisted out of the way with unnatural speed, its long limbs folding and snapping like rubber. It was too fast, too strong. It laughed again, that horrible, unnatural sound, and reached for me with a clawed hand. "Get away from him!" Jack screamed. Without thinking, Jack grabbed the shovel from the floor and swung it at the creature. The metal hit its arm with a sickening crack, but the thing didn't flinch. It didn't even seem to care. Instead, it twisted its body and drove its fingers into Jack's chest. Jack gasped, his eyes wide with shock as he stumbled backward, the creature's claws digging deeper, pushing through his shirt and into his flesh. "No!" I screamed. I moved toward Jack, desperation flooding my body. I grabbed a broken chair leg and used it like a makeshift spear, charging toward the creature's back. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I stabbed it right into the space between its ribs. The creature let out a low growl, a sound more like a rustling of leaves than any living thing I'd ever heard, but it didn't scream, it didn't howl, it just turned its head slowly, as though it wasn't even bothered by the chair leg sticking out of its back. And then, with one swift motion, it flicked Jack across the room like he was nothing more than a rag doll. He slammed into the wall, crumpling in a heap. Blood stained the floor beneath him. I screamed, "No! Jack!" But the thing wasn't done. It turned toward me with that same twisted smile on its face. Its hands reached for me, each finger like a sharpened blade. I ran. I didn't care where. I didn't care what I knocked over. I just ran. The front door, it was still locked, but maybe it would hold just long enough. I slammed into the door, my heart in my throat. The handle twisted under my hand, and for a split second I thought maybe it would open. But then I heard that scraping sound again, followed by the sound of something heavy landing behind me. Its clawed feet tapping against the floor, coming closer, closer. I spun around just as the creature reached me. It was faster than I thought it would be. Its arm shot out, knocking the chair I'd been using as a shield aside. The impact was like a truck slamming into me, sending me sprawling across the floor. My ribs cracked under the pressure, and for a moment I thought I might black out. The creature crouched low, looming over me. Its teeth gleamed, impossibly sharp and jagged, and I could see the reflection of my own terrified face in the sheen of its smooth, featureless skin. "You are ours," it hissed, and I could feel it deep in my chest. This overwhelming pressure, like the weight of the entire world, was bearing down on me. But then something strange happened. I felt it, the warmth, a pulse of heat from the hearth, the fire. I scrambled towards the fireplace, desperation pumping adrenaline into my veins. My fingers fumbled for the matches. Faster, faster. The thing was closing in on me, its hands reaching out to grip my throat. I found them. I found the matches. I struck one against the side of the box, the flame flaring to life. The firelight caught in my eyes, and with it, the memory of what I had seen when we first entered this place. The symbols. I tore the match in two and threw it into the pile of dry wood stacked by the hearth. The flames immediately shot up hot and hungry. The creature hissed, recoiling from the heat like it was burning its skin, but it didn't back off. Instead, it stepped closer, its limbs twitching as if it were being pulled toward the fire, like it wanted to be consumed. But that's when I saw it. The real fire in my hand. The lighter fluid from earlier, just sitting on the shelf, waiting. Without thinking, I grabbed the bottle, threw the cap aside, and poured it directly onto the flames. The fire erupted, roaring, spitting out orange and yellow tendrils that danced toward the creature. The thing screamed. It wasn't a scream. Not exactly. It was more like a cry of pain, something primal, like the very essence of its existence was being torn apart. It stepped back, stumbling, as the fire wrapped around it, the flame licking at its skin. It burned. The creature's skin started to melt, to disintegrate in front of my eyes, its limbs curling and twisting as if it couldn't escape the inferno. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't fast enough. I grabbed the poker from the floor, clutching it like a weapon of last resort, and charged at the creature. My movements were fueled by pure rage. I stabbed the poker directly into the thing's center, into what I could only assume was its heart. The creature screeched, a noise so high-pitched that I felt it rattle in my skull. Then, like a candle being blown out, the fire snuffed out. The creature's form collapsed into a heap of ashes, and what remained of it was gone, leaving only the faintest echo of its presence in the cabin. The silence was deafening. I stood there, my chest heaving, my body trembling from the adrenaline. My fingers were numb, my hands slick with sweat and blood. I looked around the cabin, half expecting the creature to return, to rise from the ashes and finish what it had started, but it didn't. Jack! I turned toward Jack, who was barely moving. His chest was rising and falling unevenly, and I rushed over to him, pushing aside the pain in my own body. He was alive, barely. "Jack?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "Yeah," he croaked, his eyes flickering open. You killed it." I didn't have the energy to answer. I just pulled him into my arms, holding him as if he were the only thing that mattered in this world. We were both broken, both scarred by what had happened, but we were alive, for now. But I knew one thing. The forest was still watching, and we hadn't heard the last of it. The fire had died down, but the cabin remained cold, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into the walls, into my skin, deep into my soul. It felt like the warmth of life itself had been drained from the place, leaving only the hollow echo of something long lost. Jack was still in my arms, his breath shallow, his pulse faint but steady, but the weight of what had happened hung between us like a thick fog, suffocating any hope that might have tried to take root. The creature, the thing from the basement, was gone. I had burned it, stabbed it, watched it turn to ash, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still here, still watching, still waiting. "We should leave," I whispered, but even as the words left my lips, I knew they were meaningless. It wasn't just the thing in the woods. It was something deeper, older, something that had been lying in wait, buried beneath the earth, beneath the cabin itself, a force that didn't need to be seen to be felt. And we had disturbed it. Jack groaned, shifting slightly in my arms, but he didn't speak. He just closed his eyes, exhausted, his body limp in my grip. The silence in the room was deafening, thick like smoke. I couldn't tell if it was the fire that had gone out or the presence of something still lingering in the shadows. The air itself felt wrong, tainted with something ancient, something that refused to be forgotten. Suddenly, a sound broke the stillness, a soft creaking like wood bending under pressure. I froze, listening intently. It came from the basement. I looked down at Jack. He wasn't awake, but his breathing had quickened. His face was pale, his lips trembling, as though he could feel it too, whatever it was. The trapdoor, the one that had opened earlier, was still slightly ajar. The darkness below seemed to stretch forever, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to face it, but I had to. Reluctantly, I shifted Jack off me and crawled toward the door, every movement slow, as if the very act of approaching it might awaken something else. I reached for the trap door with trembling fingers, and as I pushed it open wider, a cold, rancid smell wafted up from the basement. My stomach churned, but I couldn't look away. There was something down there, something new. I stepped back, heart racing. The trapdoor opened fully now, and through the darkness I thought I saw movement, like shadows flickering, too fast to focus on, too many to count. They seemed to move just on the edge of my vision, circling the room below. I heard it again, the same scraping noise, but this time it was different. It was closer, the low rhythmic sound of something dragging itself across the floor. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get out, but my legs wouldn't move. I wasn't alone. I never had been. The footsteps started again, slow but deliberate, dragging through the dirt below. I heard them coming up the stairs, one step after another, heavy, slow, like something was crawling toward the top, its hands scraping against the steps, pulling itself up, inch by inch. Then I saw it, a pale hand. Its fingers were long and twisted, like roots from a dead tree, dragging along the floor. The skin was cracked and torn, but there was something wrong about it. Too wrong. It shouldn't have been moving, shouldn't have been reaching for me. And then I saw the face. The same face I had seen in the woods, in the basement, in my nightmares. It wasn't quite the same, though. This one was different, more wrong. The skin was stretched taut, its features elongated, its expression frozen in a grotesque smile. And in its mouth, God, there were no teeth, only a void, a black, empty space that seemed to suck the very light from the room. It reached for me. Its claws scraped the floor, and the scraping sound grew louder. The thing didn't move like a creature anymore. It moved like something else, like an idea, a force, an ancient being that had never truly been alive, but had always existed, waiting for the right moment to emerge. I backed away, my body shaking, the cold air seeping through my bones, freezing every ounce of my will to move. It followed, one step after another, its limbs bending and breaking, folding in unnatural angles. It didn't need to hurry. It didn't need to chase. It just was patient, waiting, hungry. "Jack," I whispered, but there was no answer. His breath had stopped. I turned, and in that moment I saw him. Jack, his body lifeless, his eyes wide open but not seeing. His face was pale, drained of all color, his skin stretched tight over his skull. But there was something else, something in him. It was moving beneath his skin, a slow, undulating mass, shifting like something trying to break free from the inside. The thing reached out for him. Its hand stretched toward Jack's chest, and I saw the shadow of its fingers sink deep into his flesh, merging with him, sinking into his body, as if it were becoming part of him. And then it spoke again, its voice echoing through my mind, a voice I could feel in the marrow of my bones. "You are ours." My heart stopped. The last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed me whole was the sound of the creature's laughter, guttural, hollow, and infinite. I don't know how much time passed before I woke up. The air was still thick with cold, and when I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the cabin. I was somewhere else. The landscape stretched endlessly before me, a snow-covered expanse with no horizon, no end, and in the distance I could hear it, The soft scraping of footsteps. I wasn't alone. The thing was still here. And now, so was I. We all were. The darkness closed in around me. There was no escape.